The last winter of the war was the coldest they could remember. Snow fell over broken rooftops and empty fields where whole towns had vanished into smoke. In southern Germany, in a town called Weiden, the people no longer spoke of victory. They whispered only one question: who will reach us first? The eastern sky burned each night, a red glow no one dared to name. The Russians were coming from one side, the Americans from the other. Between them lay a country that no longer knew what it believed in. For years, propaganda had promised triumph, purity, destiny. Now all that was left were ruins and hunger. Among the thousands fleeing west were women who had worked in factories, hospitals, and offices for the collapsing Reich. They carried little more than satchels and family photos, walking for days through snow, terrified of what waited ahead. Rumors spread that the Russians punished without mercy, that the Allies would do worse. Everyone had heard stories: prisoners shot, women dragged away, villages burned. Whether true or not, fear made them real. When the first American tanks appeared beyond the forest, people hid in cellars. Children were told to stay quiet, women to keep away from the windows. The thunder of engines grew louder until one morning the ground itself trembled. Then silence. Out of the smoke rolled olive-green giants with white stars on their armor. The Wehrmacht had already surrendered in the area. The town was defenseless. A handful of soldiers stepped into the streets, rifles ready, scanning doorways. No shots were fired. For the first time in years, there was only quiet. That afternoon, a group of German women, typists, nurses, and clerks who had worked at a nearby airfield were rounded up for questioning. They were not soldiers, but the American command couldn't take chances. Each carried papers stamped with eagles and swastikas. To the victors, those papers meant loyalty to the regime. The women were ordered to walk to the town square. They expected humiliation, maybe worse. As they passed the American line, they kept their eyes on the ground. No one touched them. A sergeant merely gestured toward a truck. "Camp," he said curtly. They climbed in without protest. For the next 2 hours, the truck rolled through countryside littered with wrecked vehicles and burned trees. The wind cut through their thin coats. One woman clutched her friend's arm for warmth. They didn't speak. No one knew where they were being taken or if they would come back. When the truck finally stopped, the guards motioned them out. Before them stood a fenced compound surrounded by barbed wire. Not the horror they had imagined, but bleak enough to tighten every stomach. An American flag hung over the gate, flapping in the cold breeze. Inside, rows of canvas tents lined a muddy field. The women were counted, searched, and assigned numbers. Their possessions were taken for inventory. Then came the words they dreaded: "You are prisoners of war." They exchanged nervous glances. Prisoners, but not soldiers. Still they obeyed. Better silence than resistance. That night they huddled on straw mattresses inside the tents. Snow leaked through holes in the canvas. The air smelled of fuel and wet earth. Some whispered prayers, others simply stared at their hands. In the distance, they heard laughter, deep voices speaking English. The sound frightened them more than the guns. They imagined mockery, cruelty, revenge. After years of being told Americans were monsters, how could they expect anything else? Morning came grey and bitter. A whistle blew outside. They stepped into the cold, trembling. An American corporal stood waiting with a clipboard and translator. "Breakfast," he announced. No one moved. They thought it was a trick. The translator repeated the word in German. Frühstück. Moments later, soldiers carried metal containers to the center of the yard. Steam rose from them. The smell, coffee, bread, something sweet drifted across the air. The women stared, unbelieving. For weeks they had survived on crusts and melted snow, and now the enemy was offering food. One by one, they approached. Each received a metal bowl with porridge and a slice of bread thick with butter. Some hesitated, glancing at the guards as if waiting for a blow. None came. The corporal only nodded toward a table. When the first spoonful touched her tongue, one woman, Marta, a nurse from Munich, began to cry. The porridge was simple, barely salted, but warm. It was the first warmth she had felt in months. That evening, a rumor spread through the camp. The Americans were distributing packages, not rations, but gifts. No one believed it. Why would victors waste supplies on the defeated? Still, hope flickered. The next morning, trucks rolled in carrying boxes stamped with red crosses. Inside were things the prisoners hadn't seen in years: soap, medicine, canned meat, chocolate. When the guards opened the boxes, the scent of cocoa filled the air. The women froze. It smelled like childhood, like a world before war. An American officer stepped forward. Through a translator, he explained, "These are Red Cross parcels. Everyone gets one." The women didn't move. One whispered, "They're testing us." Another said, "They want to photograph us taking charity." But then the officer smiled, not mockingly, but kindly, and placed a bar of chocolate into the hands of the youngest girl. She stared at it, speechless. The wrapper was shiny, untouched. When she bit into it, her eyes widened, and the rest of the camp watched in silence. Then slowly, they reached out for their own. Laughter rose, tentative at first, then stronger. Some women hugged each other, others sat down and wept. For a few minutes, the war felt distant, unreal. Marta couldn't stop staring at her hands. They were cracked from months of washing bandages in icy water, but now they held a bar of soap, real soap, not the grey powder they had used in hospitals. She turned it over, smelling lavender. It made no sense. The people she had been told were barbarians smelled of flowers. Later that day, a soldier approached with a notebook and asked if anyone was a nurse. Marta hesitated, then raised her hand. He led her to a medical tent where American doctors treated wounded soldiers, some German, some American. They worked side by side, without hatred. When she reached for a bandage, the doctor nodded approvingly. "Dank," he said, the only German word he knew. That night, she couldn't sleep. The same question circled in her mind. Why are they helping us? 2 days later, the camp commander, Captain Reed, walked through the compound. He was young, barely 30, with the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much. He stopped beside the fence, watching the prisoners hang laundry to dry. "Tell them," he said to the translator, "they'll be moved soon to a civilian camp. This one's temporary." When the translator repeated the message, a wave of relief passed through the crowd. Reed noticed their confusion. "They really thought we'd hurt them?" he asked quietly. The translator nodded. They were told you shoot women. Reed sighed. Then we'll prove them wrong. That evening, he ordered extra blankets delivered to the tents. A few of his men grumbled supplies were short even for the US troops, but he insisted. The war is over, he said. It's time someone acted like it. Days turned into weeks. The women worked in the camp kitchen, cleaned, helped in the infirmary. Guards treated them with distant politeness. One morning, a truck arrived with mail bags. Through the Red Cross, letters from families began to trickle in. Some bore American stamps, forwarded from occupied towns. When Marta received her first letter, her hands shook. It was from her younger brother, still alive somewhere near Cologne. He wrote, "They treat us well here. I eat more now than in the army. Don't be afraid." She read the lines twice, then passed the paper to her friend Anna. Anna smiled faintly. Maybe everything we heard was wrong. That night, the women gathered near the fence and sang softly, not patriotic songs, but lullabies they remembered from childhood. An American sentry listened from the tower, lowering his rifle. The melody carried across the field, fragile yet unbroken. One morning, an officer entered the camp with a translator and announced that a small group would be escorted to a nearby town to clean a hospital. Volunteers only. Marta stepped forward. The others followed hesitantly. As the truck rolled through the countryside, she watched American jeeps pass by. No one jeered, no one shouted. Children waved at them from windows. It felt unreal. The world she had feared was suddenly ordinary. At the hospital, American nurses showed them where to work. They shared tools, even jokes. At noon, they were given sandwiches and hot tea. One nurse handed Marta a small mirror. "You look tired," she said with a smile. Marta almost laughed. She hadn't seen her own face in months. In the mirror, she saw a stranger, hollow-cheeked, eyes too large but alive. That night, back in camp, a storm swept over the valley. Lightning lit the tents, rain hammered the ground. Marta lay awake, listening to thunder. The world outside was changing faster than she could understand. The Reich was gone, the borders collapsing, leaders dead or vanished. All that remained were individuals, people choosing, moment by moment, whether to hate or to heal. She remembered the first morning she'd arrived, expecting torture, expecting to be nothing more than the enemy. Now she had seen kindness where she expected cruelty. It was confusing, humbling, terrifying, and somehow hopeful. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle. From somewhere beyond the fence came music, a radio playing quietly in the guard post. An American song she didn't know, slow and gentle. She closed her eyes and listened until sleep came. In the ruins of a defeated nation, the women of the camp began to see their captors not as monsters, but as men. Yet even in peace, scars of war run deep. For some, kindness was harder to accept than hunger. Rain stopped just before dawn. The camp was quiet, only the sound of boots in the mud and the low hum of a generator somewhere beyond the fence. The women woke to a different kind of silence. No whistles, no shouting guards, only the distant cry of a crow circling above. An American soldier walked through the rows of tents, calling softly for everyone to gather. His tone was almost gentle. They stepped out, half asleep, clutching their blankets against the cold morning air. The officer who stood waiting was new, tall, clean uniform, a cigarette hanging loosely from his mouth. He spoke through the translator, telling them the camp would soon be closed, that some of them would be transferred to civilian housing, others allowed to return home once cleared by military intelligence. No one cheered. They had learned that freedom in this new world always came with conditions. Marta stood at the back of the crowd, listening. The officer's English was smooth, practiced. The translator's German stumbled, as if he couldn't quite find the right tone. Return home. The words sounded too fragile to believe. Home was no longer a place. It was a memory buried under rubble. Later that morning, American trucks arrived. Soldiers unloaded crates of supplies, stacking them beside the field kitchen. The air filled with the scent of bread, soap, tobacco, and something sweet, chocolate again. The women watched silently from the fence. They didn't dare ask if it was for them. The officer from earlier appeared beside the crates. He removed his gloves, waved at the prisoners, and called out through the translator. These are for distribution. Everyone gets the same. You'll sign for your parcel. No one moved. The officer smiled faintly. Go on, he said. Marta was among the first to step forward. Her boots sank into the mud as she crossed the yard. A young American soldier handed her a brown paper parcel, heavier than it looked. She took it with both hands, murmuring thanks she wasn't sure he understood. Inside she found a small towel, toothpaste, a comb, 2 tins of food, and a folded piece of paper stamped with the Red Cross emblem. The note read, "For you from the people of America. May peace find you soon." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She looked at the soldier. He was no older than her brother had been when he went to war. His uniform was clean, his eyes tired but kind. He nodded toward the next woman in line. "Next," he said softly. By noon, the parcels were gone. The women sat in the sun, opening them carefully as if afraid they might vanish. Someone laughed, a short, sharp sound that startled everyone. It was Anna. She held up a small bar of soap shaped like a flower. "They even make soap beautiful here," she said. The others smiled. For the first time in years, laughter didn't feel like defiance, it felt like life. That afternoon, a jeep rolled into the yard. A reporter stepped out, camera slung over his shoulder. The women stiffened. Photographs meant exposure. Shame. But the American officer reassured them through the translator. No names, just history. The world needs to see that the war is really over. The photographer lifted his camera. He captured faces still wary, hands clutching their parcels like fragile treasures. When he lowered the lens, he said quietly in English, "This is what peace looks like." Marta didn't understand the words, but she felt their weight. Peace wasn't silence or surrender. It was the slow return of small, ordinary things, the smell of bread, the sound of laughter, the warmth of soap and sunlight. Days passed. The guards relaxed. The women were allowed to walk beyond the wire in groups, escorted by 2 soldiers. They washed clothes in the nearby stream, gathered wood, helped clean abandoned buildings for use as clinics. Every step outside felt like stepping into a dream where nothing was certain but the air itself. One morning, Captain Reed, The same commander who had ordered extra blankets weeks earlier called Marta and a few others to his office. The room smelled of coffee and ink. Papers covered the desk, lists of names and destinations. Reed looked up and smiled faintly. "You're cleared," he said. The translator repeated it. "You can leave tomorrow. Civilian status." Marta blinked. "Where will we go?" Reed shrugged. "Wherever home is." She hesitated. "There may be nothing left." He nodded. "Then start again." When she left the office, the others were waiting outside. She told them what he'd said. No one spoke for a while. Then Anna whispered, "I forgot how to live without orders." That night, rain returned, soft and steady. The women packed their few belongings, letters, soap, the last crumbs of chocolate. Marta sat alone for a long time, listening to the rain drum against the canvas. She thought of her brother's letter, of the doctor who had thanked her, of the soldier who handed her the parcel. The world was full of strangers, yet somehow she felt less alone. At dawn, they assembled by the gate. Trucks idled in the mist. The Americans checked papers, stamped documents, and handed out small ration packs for the journey. Marta climbed into the back of a truck, the engine's vibration humming beneath her feet. The gate creaked open. Beyond it stretched a dirt road, winding between hills green with spring. She turned for one last look at the camp, the fences, the tents, the flag lifting in the wind. The convoy moved slowly through the countryside. Villages lay silent, houses half burned, church steeples broken. But in some places, people had begun to rebuild, patching roofs, ploughing fields, hanging laundry between trees. The war had ended not in a single moment, but in millions of small repairs. When the truck stopped at a crossroads, an American soldier jumped down and pointed west. "You're free to go from here," he said through the translator. "There's a town a few kilometers that way. You can find shelter." The women climbed out, uncertain what freedom was supposed to feel like. The soldier handed Marta a small package wrapped in cloth. "For you," he said. She unwrapped it. Inside was a tin of coffee and a folded photograph of a sunrise over mountains. On the back, a note in neat handwriting, "Keep this. It helps on bad days." She tried to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. He smiled, saluted, and climbed back into the truck. The convoy rolled away, engines fading into the distance. Marta looked around. Fields stretched to the horizon. The air smelled of wet grass and wood smoke. For the first time, there were no fences. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, and whispered, "We're still here." They walked toward the town, boots crunching on gravel. Children peeked from doorways. An old woman offered water. A church bell rang somewhere far off. Life, cautious but insistent, was returning. At the edge of the town square, they found a sign nailed to a post, "Relief Station, American Zone." Inside, volunteers handed out blankets and identification papers. On a table stood a gramophone playing a song in English, slow and soft. One of the women asked the meaning of the words. A translator replied, "It says the world is new again." Marta smiled faintly. New. That word felt strange in her mouth. Days later, she found work in a small field hospital. The Red Cross needed translators and nurses. The first time she walked into the ward, she froze. Rows of wounded soldiers, German and Allied alike. She wanted to turn away, but a voice inside whispered, "This is what starting again means." She moved from bed to bed, changing dressings, taking pulses, whispering comfort. No one asked which side she had been on. The only question that mattered was, "Can you help?" One afternoon, while cleaning instruments, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Captain Reed, now without his uniform jacket, sleeves rolled up. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said. "I didn't expect to be here," she replied. He smiled. "Good. Neither did any of us." They worked in silence for a while. Then he said quietly, "I saw a photo in a newspaper yesterday. Some of your people from the camp. They're home now." "Home," she repeated softly. "I wonder what that word means anymore." Reed looked at her, thoughtful. "Maybe it just means where people stop hating each other." That night, she sat outside the hospital, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors she hadn't noticed for years. She thought of the parcels, the chocolate, the first bowl of porridge, the laughter after hunger. The gifts had been small, almost meaningless in a world so broken, but somehow they had carried her through. She took the photograph of the sunrise from her pocket and turned it over in her hands. The paper had worn soft at the edges. She placed it in her notebook beside her brother's letter and closed it gently. Behind her, the church bells rang again, 3 long notes that echoed through the hills. People were gathering for evening prayers, not of victory, but of gratitude. Marta stood, brushing dust from her skirt. She wasn't sure where she belonged, but for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. The war inside her had finally gone quiet. When she walked back into the hospital, the corridor smelled of antiseptic and coffee. A wounded man smiled faintly as she passed. "Nurse," he whispered, "thank you." She nodded. "You're welcome." Outside, the wind carried the scent of new grass through the open windows. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistled, its sound not of departure, but of return. Years later, people would forget the small camp near Weiden. They would remember great battles, generals, treaties. But for the women who had lived those weeks behind the wire, the memory that endured wasn't of captivity. It was of the morning the Americans opened the gates and gave them something they hadn't felt in years. Not food, not freedom, but dignity. And that, more than victory or revenge, was how peace began. The sun rose over the Bavarian hills like a promise. The world that had ended in smoke was now trying to remember how to breathe again. Fields once scorched by tanks were turning green, rivers clearing from the ashes of factories. Everywhere, people were rebuilding with wood, with bricks, with silence. But for Marta, peace didn't arrive with flags or parades. It arrived one small act at a time. In the hospital where she worked, she began to see familiar faces, other women from the camp. Some had found work as cooks, some as cleaners, some simply came for the warmth of the stoves. They greeted her shyly at first, still unsure how to exist without fences around them. But there was something new in their eyes, a light she hadn't seen since before the war. One afternoon, a Red Cross truck pulled into the courtyard. An American officer stepped out, holding a clipboard. He called for volunteers to help deliver medical supplies to nearby towns. Marta raised her hand before she could think. The officer smiled and said, "Good. We need people who still remember what helping means." The road took them through villages where walls still bore bullet holes, where church bells rang again for the first time in years. Children waved as the truck passed. Old men lifted their hats. In one village, they stopped at a makeshift clinic set up in an old schoolhouse. Marta carried boxes inside, careful not to step on the cracked floorboards. The doctor there, a young Frenchman with a tired smile, asked where she was from. "Munich," she said quietly. He nodded. "Once enemies," he said. "Now just people." She didn't answer, but inside she knew he was right. That night, as they returned to the hospital, Marta looked out across the fields. Fires burned in distant hills, not from bombs this time, but from farmers clearing old debris. She thought of her brother, of the days before the world went mad. Somewhere in those hills, maybe he was alive, maybe not. But for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. Weeks passed. Summer arrived with golden fields and the hum of insects. Life began to resemble something ordinary. Cafes reopened. Markets filled with chatter. Newspapers carried headlines not about death, but about rebuilding. Yet every joy carried a shadow, reminders of what had been lost, of what could never return. One evening, after her shift, Marta walked to the edge of the town, where a small American post had been set up. She found Captain Reed sitting on the steps, smoking. He smiled when he saw her. "Still here?" She nodded. "For now." He looked toward the horizon, where thunderclouds were gathering. "Funny thing about wars," he said. "Everyone fights for something they think will last. But it's what comes after that decides who we really are." Marta sat beside him. "And who are we now?" He flicked the ash from his cigarette. "People trying to deserve peace." A sudden gust of wind lifted dust around their feet. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, washing over the courtyard, over the mud, over the old bloodstains that still clung to the ground. Neither of them moved. They let it fall. The next morning, she woke to find a letter waiting for her at the hospital. It was from her brother. The handwriting was shaky, but familiar. He was alive, working with an aid group near Cologne. He wrote that he'd seen American soldiers helping rebuild bridges, not destroying them. He said he couldn't explain the feeling, only that the world seems different now, as if it's learning to be kind again. Marta folded the letter carefully and placed it in her pocket. When she stepped outside, the air smelled of wet earth and lilacs. The war had taken everything that once defined her, but it had left one thing, the ability to choose what kind of person she wanted to be. That day, a group of refugees arrived at the hospital, families who had walked for days from the east. Among them were women and children so thin they looked like ghosts. Without being told, Marta gathered blankets, water, and bread. When one of the children reached for her hand, she froze for a moment, then knelt and smiled. The boy smiled back. In that simple exchange, something inside her finally healed. Time moved quietly after that. The American post closed. Captain Reed left without ceremony. Before he went, he gave Marta a small notebook. Inside the cover he'd written, "When you heal others, you heal yourself." She kept it with her always. Years later, she would marry a teacher from Munich, have 2 children, and tell them stories about the war, not of battles or generals, but of ordinary people who chose compassion when hatred was easier. When a daughter once asked, "Mama, were you ever afraid of the Americans?" she smiled sadly. At first, yes. But then one of them gave me chocolate. On the anniversary of the war's end, she returned to Wyden. The camp was gone, replaced by a meadow of wildflowers. She stood where the gate had once been, closed her eyes, and listened to the wind. It carried faint echoes, laughter, footsteps, the murmur of languages mixing together. Peace, she thought, is not built by governments, but by hands that stop trembling long enough to help someone else. She knelt, picked a small yellow flower, and placed it on the ground. Then she whispered the names of the women she remembered: Anna, Clara, the young girl with the chocolate. The wind answered with a soft sigh through the grass. When she stood, the sun was setting behind the hills, turning the sky to gold. She smiled, not at the past, but at the strange beauty of what survived it. As she walked back toward the road, a train passed in the distance, its whistle long and low. The sound carried through the valley, familiar yet new, like the voice of a world still learning how to forgive. And that is how her story ended, not with victory, not with sorrow, but with the quiet, stubborn act of living. Because in the ruins of a broken century, Marta and countless others discovered a truth deeper than any flag or nation. That kindness, once given, never truly dies.